Hi everybody, and welcome to my first of two videos on this, the Olympus Pen F. I'd like to start off first by saying thank you very much to Dan at the Shawnee Union channel, and you can get a link to his channel in the description. Dan loaned me this absolutely fantastic copy of the Pen F and has not given me any trouble for holding onto it for about 3.5 or 4 months longer than I promised him I would. So thank you very much, Dan. This is the Olympus Pen F. It is a half frame interchangeable lens SLR. Now what that means, the interchangeable lens part simply means that the lenses can be taken off and swapped out for other lenses. The SLR part means that it has one lens, the light travels through the lens, bounces around a system of mirrors in here, and comes out the viewfinder so you see what the picture is going to see. And half frame means that the images are half the size of a normal 35mm frame. And we'll talk about this a little bit more in the video. This camera has no light meter. It has shutter speeds from 1 second to 1/500th of a second and bulb. The viewfinder magnification is 80% or 0.8x, meaning it's just slightly smaller than the actual image size. I could not find the viewfinder frame coverage for this camera anywhere in any of the materials I looked at, the manual, not online, nothing that I could find listed it. But it feels like it's pretty decent. It's not 100%, but it might be about 92. It has a plain matte focusing screen, which is not interchangeable. And the flash on this camera will sync at any speed. It's one of the very few SLRs that doesn't have a leaf shutter that will sync the flash at any speed up to and including the fastest speed of 1/500th of a second. And when we talk about flash use, I'll explain why it is that that works and how the shutter mechanism works to allow that. This camera was targeted at entry and enthusiast photographers. It had twice the frame count, which means each picture cost half as much. When you can put 72 frames on a standard 36 exposure roll of film, you're cutting your cost per picture in half. So theoretically, yes, you could use this for professional photography like street or documentary photography, newspaper photography as well. But really, the market was for people who were looking to save costs on film and get their film dollar to stretch just a little bit further. It was produced by Olympus in Japan from 1963 until 1966. It was preceded by a whole lineage of Olympus pen cameras, but this was the first of the pen cameras with an interchangeable lens. Concurrently, it was made alongside the Pen D, EES, Wide, and EM, as well as a number of Olympus rangefinders. This predated the Olympus M series cameras, so it was not made concurrently with any of their professional grade SLRs. It was followed by the Pen FT. Okay, if you have your Pen F, let's take a look at the features and I'll tell you what everything on this is. On the sides here, we'll start with the camera top, but on the sides technically we have the strap lugs, and this is where you would put a couple of split rings to attach your camera strap. This is the film rewind knob with the film rewind lever that pops out of it, and this is what you would use to rewind your film when you're done with a roll. Pen F, the model indication, serial number. This is the shutter release button right here. And as you might have heard, it has a pretty light shutter release sound. Let me grab my mic. So let's hear what that shutter release sounds like up close. It also, because of the shutter design, which we'll talk about again in a little bit, has a very light shutter action. This orange line is your frame indicator, and these numbers that you probably saw advancing as I recocked the shutter are your frame count. So right now we're on frame 4 of up to 72, so there's still a long way to go on this roll of film. Here we have the front of the camera. The front doesn't have a whole lot on it. We have the shutter speed selector right here, and there's the little red dot here is your shutter speed index. That tells you what shutter speed you're on. So right now I'm on 1/250th. Now I'm on 1/15th. So you can see the little numbers right there that tell you your shutter speed. And the lower the number, the longer your shutter speed is going to be. That's the fraction of a second. So if you went all the way down to 1, your shutter speed would be a full second. At bulb, your shutter is open, close. As long as you hold the shutter release down, your shutter will stay open. The next thing that we have here is the lens mount. This is the lens mounting index, and we'll see in the second video exactly how to mount lenses, but this is the red dot you'll need when we mount the lenses. And then of course we have the logo on the front. Here on the camera's bottom, we don't have very much again. We have the tripod bushing here, and we have the film release button right here. When you go to rewind the film, you have to depress this, and that will release some gears inside of the camera's body that will allow the film to now be rewind. And we'll see a bit more about how this works in the second video when we talk about how to load film, unload film, and we see it moving through the camera so you can understand the mechanism that occurs inside your camera when you're taking a picture. Here we have the back of the camera, and there's not a whole lot to see here. We have the viewfinder window, and as you might notice, it's portrait orientation, and as you might have seen inside the camera, the shutter opening is also portrait orientation. We'll talk about that in a minute as well. And here's the film advance, and this is a double stroke film advance that you use to advance your film after you've taken a picture. So let's take a look inside the camera, and to get into the camera, you just lift up on the film release or film rewind knob, and that opens up the camera's back. So this is what's inside the camera. We have the film cassette chamber right here. This is where the film will be loaded when you go to take pictures. These 4 silver rails are guide rails, and what these do, the top and bottom ones, keep the film from sliding up and down as it travels through the camera. The 2 middle ones help keep the film flat on plane when the pressure plate, which we'll see in just a second, presses up against them. The silver window here is the shutter window rather. Here we have the film tension sprocket, and the film sprocket holes fit into here so the film can't pull back and help cause a double exposure. And this also helps to keep the film flat on plane as it's advanced through the camera. Here is the film take-up spool. So as you take pictures, the film is taken up on this spool. Over here we have the film pressure plate and the cassette retaining bit. When the film back is closed, the film pressure plate rests right about here to put pressure on the film to keep it flat so that the light is focused properly where the film is located in the camera. So some notes on the Olympus Pen F. This was the first 35mm half frame system SLR, meaning there were other half frame SLRs made by Olympus before this, but this was intended to be a system SLR with multiple lenses, different adapters for it. There were adapters you could get that allowed it to be mounted on a microscope, for instance, or a binocular microscope, and you could get viewfinder attachments, different things that allowed this to do a lot of different functions that previous half frame cameras couldn't do. That had a lot of advantages for scientists who were doing research on a budget because they didn't have to spend as much on film, and film has always been somewhat expensive. This has a rotary shutter in it, which is a much different design than a standard camera shutter. And what we can do is we can take a little bit of a look here, and here's the mirror. So when you take a picture, the mirror actually physically flips out of the way to the side. And behind it, there's a rotary shutter, and I'll insert a picture right now as I'm talking, showing you what the rotary shutter looks like. So when you push the shutter release, and I'm going to have it on bulb here, you won't be able to see the action of the shutter, but you'll be able to see a little bit about how this works. The mirror flips up here. The shutter opens up to expose the film to the light coming through the lens, and then when the shutter motion ends, it just undoes it. So one of the genius things about this rotary shutter is that because it opens up to expose the entire frame at any given time, in any shutter speed, the entire frame is exposed to light at the same time, for a very, very brief moment that allows this camera to have a flash sync speed of any shutter speed. It's a fantastic design. So a good question is, how come rotary focal plane shutters weren't used on all 35mm cameras? Couple of reasons. Really, pretty much your physical limit on these is about a 500th of a second, which is not fast enough for most professional photographers, even back in the 60s. Secondly, scaling a shutter like this up to 35mm would require it to be about 4 times the same size. Now, that's because this camera is so much smaller than a standard 35mm SLR. So here is an AV1, which is a very much later and very small SLR compared to this. You can see the body size is about the same, but this has a focal plane cloth shutter in it. Right there, you can see it. And so this is a different type of shutter where the cloth rolls up and out of the way. A rotary shutter works by having a disc where it's a half circle here that's closed, let's say, and then a half circle that's open to expose the film. Well, you can imagine that if you had to have a circle that covered this size frame, it would have to be about this big, meaning that your camera would have to be at least twice as tall for a rotary shutter to work in a full frame 35mm camera. So having a rotary shutter makes this camera need to be at least 4 times as big to make it a full frame camera. So it's a really ingenious piece of engineering for this camera that solves a really complicated problem, but it's not scalable. The shutter engineering on this camera, which I point out again, is because the engineering behind it was extremely complicated. It took a long time for Olympus to really figure out how to make it work, how to time it, and the engineers who did work on this camera shutter were really fantastically talented and incredibly gifted people who figured out a very good, simple, and clever solution to a difficult problem. They really did exactly what engineers are supposed to do and did it very, very well. So a couple more things about this camera. One of the things that made the shutter design really fantastically genius is they use a titanium fan. Rotary shutter, fan shutter. It'll be called different things depending on where you look. So they use this titanium fan, and because of its design, it has effectively 0 vibration, and that's due to the design. It's also due to physics as well as the design. But the shutter in this camera introduces less shake than any other camera I've ever used. And this is a 1960s camera, and it's all mechanical. There's no electronics in it. It's all spring action and clockwork. It's really phenomenal, really, really phenomenal. And also, the rangefinder-like design on this camera stems from the mirror system for the viewfinder. So a lot of people would look at this and think it's a viewfinder, even though it's actually an SLR. And I mean, aesthetically, the design on this camera is really phenomenal. It epitomizes a lot of the best of 1960s era camera design in one very attractive and compact package. So this camera does have one Achilles heel. The Achilles heel is in the system that takes light from this mirror to the viewfinder. So what happens is light comes through the lens and hits the mirror, and it's directed into a prism that's right behind here. You can actually see the prism right in there, perhaps. Yeah, there you can see it. So that's a prism. That prism redirects the light up this way, and there's a mirror right about here, sits at about a 45-degree angle, that then bounces the light this way into another prism. Now this one turned at 90 degrees this way, this one turns at 90 degrees back into the viewfinder. So it's got 2 prisms, a mirror and a mirror. That's a lot of surfaces for dust to get on. And many of these cameras have very dusty, dirty viewfinders. Now these cameras, because of the use of this mirror here, already have significantly dimmer viewfinders than equivalent full-frame cameras. And that's just what happens when light travels through multiple glass-to-air interfaces. Mirrors take away more light than prisms do, things like that. So adding an already slightly dimmer viewfinder to a viewfinder prone to getting surface dirt on the prisms and mirror here, these can have very dirty viewfinders. So it's worth, if you get one of these, having it cleaned, having a professional take care of it just to make sure everything works, but also really to clean off the surfaces of the prism system in this camera to give you the brightest viewfinder you can get. So some things not to do with this camera. First off, don't touch the shutter. And the shutter is the silver bit that we saw inside the camera right here when we had it open. Don't touch that. Especially don't stick your finger in it if you hold down the bulb mode and open it up and then close it. Don't let it close on your finger. That's a really great way to ruin an otherwise perfectly good camera. Don't touch the mirror that we saw in here with your finger, because that's a surface coated mirror, meaning the silver is on top of the glass, and your finger oils will cause that silver to tarnish, and that's not something that could be cleaned up, and it will affect the performance of your camera and how well you can focus images in your viewfinder. Also, don't leave your camera or lenses in your car, because they can get both heat and cold damage. Heat will cause oils, especially in the lens, but also in the camera, to get really thin, and then they get to places they aren't supposed to be, like the aperture blade, on the lens elements, or within other gears in the camera. And then the temperature returns to normal, and the camera doesn't work properly anymore. The aperture doesn't stop down, things like that. So don't let this get really hot, because it will cause the oils to go everywhere. Also don't leave it in your car, because if it gets really cold in the winter, the oils will get very thick, and then they start to break down and get gummy, and then the camera won't work properly either. Also, having a camera in your car is a great way to say to somebody who would be inclined to do this, break into my car, please. And aside from losing your camera, then you have the insurance issues and the broken window, and trust me, you don't want to have to go through that. I've been there. So it's just a good idea not to leave your camera in your car. Also, don't store your camera in a plastic bag or box. There's an exception if you have a very good rechargeable desiccant pack. You can get away with it. That's how I do it, but I have to recharge the desiccant packs regularly. But it's a good idea not to do that, because moisture will get into the plastic box, and it will cause fungus to grow on your lenses or in your covering or within your camera, and fungus on your lenses can impair image quality. It will definitely ruin the value of them, and fungus or mildew in your leather covering will cause the camera to smell like mildew, and that's really gross when your nose is pressed up against it. Also, don't let your camera get wet. This is not a weather-sealed camera. Rain will get into it, and it will cause some of the mechanisms in it to rust, and you definitely don't want that. And just remember, your camera is a precision tool and should be handled with care and respect. And as long as you take care of your camera will take care of you. So this is my first video on the Olympus Pen F. If this video was helpful, please give me a thumbs up. That lets me know I'm on the right track and that I'm producing content which is useful to you. If you have questions or comments, please leave those in the comments below. I'm more than happy to respond, and if you have suggestions, I'm more than happy to make those videos if I have the equipment and technical know-how. If you'd like to subscribe to find out when I have more videos released, you can do that by hitting the subscribe button. And one last thing, thank you very much for watching, and take great photos.